All right, we will go ahead and get started with our first tutorial. So we have building a sustainable R ecosystem for reporting. So our speaker here is Lindsey Dietz. Lindsey Dietz is a financial economist for the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, where she provides quantitative leadership to large bank stress testing efforts. She is a co-leader of Our Ladies Twin Cities and has been on the North Organizing Committee for 3 years. Since 2019, she has been an AAAS If Then ambassador, serving as a role model for the next generation of girls and women in STEM. Lindsey has a BS and MS in mathematics from the University of Minnesota Duluth, where she is also in the Athletic Hall of Fame for her accomplishments in basketball. She received her PhD in statistics from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Thank you so much, Lindsey, for this tutorial.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, everyone, for joining. As Christina said, I've been one of the co-organizers of North, and we really appreciate everyone joining. I know it's been a long pandemic, and we've had a lot of virtual conferences, but we're really excited to bring you another version of North, and in particular, trying out these tutorials this year. We'd love to have your feedback, as Christina said, with these a bit longer form talks so that you can dive a little bit more into the materials. So the first thing I want to encourage you to do, if you haven't already clicked one of those GitHub links that we dropped into the chat, is to head over to GitHub. If you're an avid Git user, you can clone the repository, or you can just skip that and download the zip file to get all of the files that are out here for this talk and the talks tomorrow, or the talk later today and tomorrow. I would encourage you to maybe refresh that after the conference as well, just to make sure you get any updates added. So I've listed all of my information here. The talk, as I mentioned, is also in that GitHub file. So you should be able to connect with me on any one of those platforms or email me if you would like. So first thing I have to say, because I'm a Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis employee, that any views that I'm presenting here are strictly my own. I don't represent the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or the Federal Reserve System in this capacity. So Christina just talked about my bio. I've put a couple links here just to give you guys a little bit better idea of my background. So as she mentioned, I work on stress testing modeling, in particular, working in the implementation and development of analytics surrounding the outcomes of the stress tests that we conduct annually. We've also put links here if you would like to join or present at a future Our Ladies meetup, and then some links to other bits of my bio in case you're interested in finding out more about me. So with that, I'll jump into the tutorial material. I would encourage you to drop questions in the chat as we go. As noted by Christina, she can interrupt me at any time and make sure that we get answers if I can answer your questions. So the main goal of this tutorial is to help introduce some tools and basically build an ecosystem so you can communicate your data stories in a professional, sustainable, and beautiful way. So this picture, which I did not make, it's a Allison Horst artwork original, sort of assumes you've gone through the steps of, importing your data, tidying up your data, doing any analysis that you're looking to do. And you're at sort of the communication step where you're ready to sort of build a report that goes out to your end users and communicate your results. So the highlights of this tutorial, really it's going to focus on how to set up that ecosystem and to support report creation, mainly in HTML. There'll also be a little bit of information on how to build PDFs, but focusing mostly on HTML. Sorry. There we go. So some examples of table and graphics packages that you can use to support your analysis. And then hopefully along the way, some tips and tricks sprinkled in about how to make your reports dazzling and reproducible. So some things not in this tutorial that hopefully you can go out and do some future work on yourself. I'm not going to talk about how to set up all of the version control, but I would highly encourage everyone to use version control when you're setting up reporting, especially to make it sustainable for the future. And this Jenny Bryan's Happy Git and GitHub with R is a great reference. Tells you how to do all of the sort of mysterious setup work that goes with GitHub that she makes quite easy. The details of the packages of the tables that make tables and graphics, I won't go into detail. They're really just there as placeholders. I think probably everyone at this conference would like to design very specific tables and graphics for their needs. So just sort of put those in as placeholders for you to look into further. And also Shiny. So this is really focusing on reports that maybe don't need additional ecosystems to support them outside of your home computer and maybe version control. But Shiny requires a little bit more tooling. And so I won't talk about that, but there are a few talks tomorrow, I think, where people will talk through more Shiny and also some other graphics packages and table packages. So you'll definitely get a taste of that tomorrow. So let's talk through sort of what an older process of reporting might have looked like. So you do analysis in a tool, hopefully R, given the crowd that we have here, but it might have been SAS or SPSS or MATLAB or something, else out there, even Excel. You might have made tables and charts in Excel. Hopefully you've transitioned that over to R, but sometimes Excel, is just sort of drag and drop, and that might have been how you've made charts. Then I certainly remember doing this for my dissertation, pasting everything into some spot to publish into Word or LaTeX. See someone posting that they like Mathematica. Absolutely. So pasting everything into your Word or LaTeX and then turning that into a final product, which is probably a PDF. Maybe its final destination is a Word document, something like that. So that's several steps. And in the end, basically, you don't have a process that's necessarily reproducible or sustainable. You might have pieces of the process that are, set up more for doing the report again, like the R piece, but the rest of it is more manual process. And so I want to teach you all to do a little bit less in your process so that you can spend more time doing the interesting analysis work than some of the manual setup. So that's where we get into the idea of building this R ecosystem for reporting. And the first item is something very simple, but perhaps is not something that a lot of people have used before, which is R projects. So basically, this little artwork says create workflows that shred. So going from sort of worrying about where all your file paths are pointing by using a get WD command or set WD command and shifting to an R project interface. So what is an R project? Here's a little quote from Hadley Wickham from his R for Data Science book, that R experts keep all the files associated with a project together, input data, R scripts, analytical results, figures. This is such a wise and common practice that RStudio has built-in support for this via projects. So the key to R projects is that they define your working directories, and then you don't need to worry about it anymore. So it makes any paths that you're referencing in your project relative rather than being fixed to something on your computer, and makes your work portable and tidy. So you can just send it off to one of your teammates or your boss. And, you know, ideally, if they have sort of a similar setup, they can just run your code and run your R Markdown document. So I thought we would try it. I purposely did not add an R project to the tutorial information. There is one sort of setup step that hopefully many of you have already done, but if not, it is basically to change your global options and avoid saving your .r data. I know it's maybe something that seems like a good idea to have your R data restored each time you open RStudio, but it can sometimes cause problems. So if you haven't, at least for the purposes of this talk, I recommend going to your global options, unchecking this restore R data, and changing your options to say never. So that's basically step one. And if you hadn't already done that before, then you'd want to restart RStudio. I'd already had it done, so I'm not going to restart it. And now we're going to create an R project. So before I create it, I just want to give you a sense of where I'm at. So I'm just sitting on my desktop. And if I wanted to reference a file or a different script, I would have to write out the entire path to where it's located. But now I'm going to create a project. So I just say new project, and I'm going to associate it with an existing directory. I'm going to pick to go inside of my tutorial. Give it a second. And then create project. So it looks like nothing is basically changed, except for that I have this R project file. But a few things have changed. So now if I say get work directory again, now I can see that that has actually updated to be where I'm at inside of my folder, which was inside this 2021 talks, inside my tutorial, inside this building R eco folder. You can also see I suddenly have a Git window pop up, which is because I actually cloned the folder and I have write access to the North Conference folder. So it's noting that, you know, I can add this to the Git repository, which is another really nice function of our projects, is that it can sort of contain your Git connections as well. But essentially, it hasn't changed any of my files. It just sits there. And so one thing you'd want to do, if you can remember, is basically each time, whoops, sorry. Each time you go to open up your project, sorry, I've lost my folder. Give me 1 second. Okay, so when you go to open your folder, if you open your R project, it'll automatically open up right into the space where you want to be, which is right where that R project exists. So let me shift back. So basically, I would recommend doing that for any project you're going to put out there. So the key portion of this talk now, after you sort of created that R project, is really about R Markdown and all of the features that R Markdown has that help you create basically magical reports. So what is R Markdown? So basically it's R code with Markdown language, which is a text to HTML conversion tool. So it allows you to run R code chunks inside of this sort of text to HTML creator. It also allows you to use things like LaTeX, mathematics inside of this text to HTML converter. And so there are 3 ways that you could use this kind of file. So you could just simply use R Markdown as an environment to do data science. I definitely have colleagues and friends who like to just do their coding in R Markdown rather than in R scripts at this point. You might use it to collaborate with other data scientists. In particular, your fellow data scientists might have interest in your conclusions, but also they want to know the details of the code behind the conclusions you're making, because they may have a similar problem and it would just be easier for them to reuse your code. And really the one we're going to focus on mostly within this talk is how to use this R Markdown tool to communicate to decision makers who really care about the conclusions, but not as much about the code behind the analysis. So we're going to sort of segue into working within the R Markdown files that are inside the tutorial folder. So I'm going to switch back over. You can click on the report folder. You see I have these numbered RMD files. I'm going to start with 0 and walk through sort of the details of this R Markdown file. So if you want, you can click knit right away and just check that it actually works and builds you a little report file. You can get the sense of what this is going to look like. Have some tabs, have a graph, some links, there's some hidden code. And so I'll walk through a little bit of how each of these sections of the R Markdown file work to start with. So if you hit any snags when you click that knit button, like you maybe didn't have a package installed, this would be a good time to install those as well. So to start off with, there's something called the YAML header. According to Wikipedia, which is the best source, obviously, YAML stands for YAML Ain't Markup Language, which I just found pretty hilarious. I think it used to stand for maybe yet another markup language, but this is now seemingly the official definition. What you need to know about it is basically anything between these first 3 dashes and second 3 dashes is called YAML and behaves differently than the rest of the document. So it is not our code. It has some different features, some things you need to pay attention to, like indentation will have an impact on how this loads. But really, there's just sort of a series of keywords. So like title, author, date, output. And then after that, a value that basically goes with those keywords. So I've got a title and myself listed as the author. Here's something very interesting. So in the date, you can actually use some sort of inline R code within your header. So I have used this, single apostrophe, and then the lowercase letter R indicates that there's some R code coming. And then I use the sysdate function. This way, I never have to actually manually type a date. It just knows that date automatically that I generate the report. The other key bit is output. So I could simply have gotten rid of this part of it and just left it as an HTML document. I'm just going to undo that. But I also wanted some options for my HTML document. So there are lots of themes you can choose from, some links later on that have, some themes that built-in themes you can choose from. This is like what kind of code highlighting theme that I want. And then something very useful for, thinking about your decision makers who maybe don't care about the code, but other people might, is to have this code folding set to hide, which means that like when I generated it before, you kind of have the option to see the code, but you also just by default don't show it. So you can show everything at once, or you can open up code as you scroll through the report. So that's the YAML header. We'll continue to add on to that as we go through other parts of the report. So one other thing to note is that this is a comment. This is not an R comment, but this is how you comment in HTML. And so you can use that format to comment your R Markdown document. So you'll notice that none of this text that is right now highlighted and is in purple is not going to show up in the report. So you can actually comment your R Markdown in the same way that you would comment your code. So getting into this first R chunk, so you can see here now I have a more, it's not inline R chunk, but it has 3 apostrophes and then a curly brace and then the lowercase letter R again. This is a name for the chunk, which is an optional thing to do, but it can be really nice to do that if you have a lot of R chunks, because then you can use this sort of outline feature. And if you need to update a specific chunk, you can remember what it means instead of it just being sort of a blank title. This include means that I don't want this to be shown in the document. So I've set that to false. And then these options are nice to have. Like basically what I'm doing here is setting up the defaults for my R chunks. So essentially I don't want my my code to be sort of shown by default. I don't want it to see any messages or warnings in my report if I'm showing the output of code. So like when libraries load, they might give you a message that you're not really interested in, but I would leave maybe those off when you're developing things, but when you're ready to sort of finalize, you might want to turn those to false. And then here I just have a little bit of text. If you use the sort of apostrophes, it'll make things have more of like a code feel. And now here I'm getting into sort of the first important reporting element, which is building out tabs. So you notice here also that there's these hashtags. Basically, one hashtag means something similar to header 1. 2 is something similar to header 2, and so forth. There's an R Markdown cheat sheet that has a lot of detail about these different formatting options. There's also things like double asterisk can turn things bold, single turns it into italics, and so forth. So I'll talk about this tab set. So essentially what this is doing is giving me those nice tabs that I have here. So you can see that there's no wording that goes with this tab set. But basically this says, I want a tab set. This says what kind of tab set it is. So this style is called pills. And there's a few other styles that you can choose from. And then anything below that, that's like a header below that, becomes one of the tabs. So you can see some info has translated to be the first tab, and plot, which you don't actually see in the R Markdown file yet, is the next tab. You can also see that the language that I have above those tabs is there regardless of which tab that I'm on. So the rest of this, this kind of first document is mostly just showing some of the different R Markdown features. So putting things in dollar signs and turns things into sort of like LaTeX formatted math. And it's nice, it'll show you a little preview. If you notice, it doesn't quite look exactly the same in the final report because of the theming that I've chosen. And one other thing to note is that sometimes when you choose themes, they don't always work exactly the way you want them to. So I've picked something, I wanted this part to be in bold, but you can see that it doesn't really look very bolded. So sometimes you just have to work through those little quirks. There are definitely many themes and templates you can use for building these reports, but not every feature works exactly the same in each theme or template. So now we're getting into where I'm actually doing a bit more code. So I'm loading some R libraries. I'm loading some that I didn't want the users to see. So you can see I don't have a section for that first set of libraries, but then I said I do want the user to be able to see that I'm doing R Markdown and ggplot. So there I've changed the include equals false. I just left it at the default, which was true. And then here's just an example of where I'm building a function. So I'm grabbing some data from the Fred database on unemployment. I've built this function that gets 4 different series of data and returns them to me. And then I'm creating that data frame so that I can use it later for plotting. And so finally, we can see where that plot tab comes from. There's some features again in the R chunks. So I set figure width equal to 10. Some of this just requires some dialing in each time you create a new chart or have a standard, to determine what size you want it to be. And I've just created a pretty simple line chart to go in that plot section. So basically you can see the data, and I didn't make any updates really to the standard ggplot formats. Okay, so that is the starting point. So I'm going to move forward into number 1, which starts off basically the same. What I want to highlight here is that before I had this pretty long piece of code that was sort of in the middle of my R Markdown document. Now, you can imagine, like, if this was really my end state, it wouldn't be that big of a deal, but you might have a report that requires, several different pieces of formatting that, you have a much longer code base associated with your report. So one of the best sort of organizational tips is to move that out of your report and into a separate R script that's just sourced by your report. So if I scroll back down to that portion of the report, you can see that now instead of, 50-ish lines of code, I am just sourcing a script where I've moved this function and then immediately calling the function. Here is also where the R project comes in handy. Right now I'm in the report folder. So basically what I need to do is tell R I need to move up 1 folder from the report folder. So that would be into the building R eco. And then I move back into the scripts folder, and then that's where my Fred script lives. And so if I open that, it basically just has the same function, returns the same stuff, but now it's completely separate. This is also great for editing. Someone can edit the function separately or test the function separately without worrying about dealing with the overhead, basically, of knitting the report each time you want to make a change to your function. So that can probably see how it quickly would add up if you had several functions or pieces of R code within your report. So now I'm going to jump into the third, I should say. Okay. So this to me has been probably the most useful reporting technique that I've found in some of the work that I've done, which is adding parameters to your report. And it might seem like a pretty simple idea, but it feels like under advertised to me, I guess, from the R community. So I want you all to use it and evangelize for it in the future. So basically you can see here, I've added this param section to my YAML header. And then underneath I have something department, plot type, data start date, data end date. So let's take a look at this department one. So before I just said I'm creating this report for the management committee, and I had the words management committee here. Now I can use this inline R code format, the lowercase r, and to call that parameter, this params is created in your environment when you knit this R report, and I get department filled in. So let's just take a look at the report. I'm just knitting it. So you can still knit just the same way you did. And you can see that where it has that R code, now it's filled in with the words management committee. And then I said I'm creating a plot using this params plot type, which right now I've selected pie charter as my option. So this plot type one is a little bit more specific because I don't want to just have any value. I've only coded options to do high charter, ggplot2, or plotly. So essentially I can say the default value is high charter, but then I can give the user choices, and I'll show you how to get to those choices. So basically right now when I click knit, it just does the default, which is knit to HTML, and uses all the default values that I have in parameters. But I can actually click knit with parameters, and like basically a dashboard pops up to give me the option. So if I said, well, I want a fixed plot, I can change it to ggplot. And if I said, well, I want this to go to human resources, if I can type, then I can do that on the fly without changing anything in my R Markdown file. So now I've got human resources, it says I'm creating a plot using ggplot2, and I'm back to sort of my fixed plot. So this can be really powerful, can give you, like, you hand off the code to someone else, they can kind of customize it. You could even get, the end users building their own reports in this way. If they start to ask for a lot more interactivity, then it's maybe time to consider a switch to Shiny. But for sort of a specific coded set of options where there's maybe not too many choices, this is a really sort of game changer. The other pieces that I had here were the start and the end date for the data. So it gives someone a little bit more ability to customize that piece of it. So if I scroll back down to where I have that function, now you can see, rather than hard coding those dates, I have the ability for the user to provide the dates. So one other thing I wanted to highlight about this function while we're here is that on occasion, you may be sourcing from data sources that aren't reproducible or change over time. So another thing to think about when you are building reports, if they need to be sort of consistent over time, is you might want to have the data stored So each time I run this function with a new end date, I create a file that actually has that data. In this case, the data is small enough that that's not a big problem. If you're getting into a situation where you're creating data that's really big, you might want to consider, storing to a database rather than just a folder within your R project. So what's also nice about this, these parameterization features, if you are in a company that has access to sort of enterprise tools such as like RStudio Connect, this kind of functionality can be built in when you deploy that report. So basically people can just essentially see the deployed version and set parameters in that sense. So they don't even work directly with the R Markdown file or RStudio. They're really just seeing things, on the back end where you've already deployed it, almost as sort of like a website that they're interacting with. All right. So moving into the third file. So the things that I want to highlight here are basically adding or I'll focus a little bit on the table making and the graphics packages that I added in here, but also some more maybe advanced HTML use. So to start with, I'll talk about this HTML piece. Right. Okay. So one thing that I've found useful, I'm just going to knit this so you can see what it looks like, is that like while the decision makers maybe don't care about pieces of the code or parameters that were used to create the final report, your fellow colleagues want to make sure that things have been done correctly and like the right values have been used. So putting in what I like to call Easter eggs, basically for your fellow colleagues, can be really helpful. So here I've got this little drop down that people would want to know which dates that I put in. But you can imagine there are other things that just teams may need to audit to make sure that the report has been generated correctly, depending on how it's being used. So how did I build this little drop down? Basically, I used HTML directly within R Markdown. So this details functionality is what gives you that option to drop down. And then this is just the title of that piece. And then here's a little R code chunk, which I did not give a name in this case. So you can see how it's just called chunk 5, but I could have given it a name. And then I've printed what I call analyst info, which I had assigned here by just creating a data frame with the start date and the end date. So there's, if you have even just a little bit of knowledge of HTML, which I would say I don't, I end up just Googling things, and you can successfully add in little HTML widgets like this. If you take it one step further and become more of a like cascading style sheet expert, you can really make things sing. I haven't gone to that extent, but that's sort of an extension. If you learn more about those pieces, you can definitely develop your own custom theming, put in your company like colors and logos and all of that kind of thing. So just now to highlight a little bit of what I've done with the tables. So I've added in a couple of options. So you can see I added a table tab called interactive tables. You can see below that I have 3 hashtags, and I've actually turned this tables tab into another set of tabs. Oh, sorry. So underneath the first set of tabs of another tab. You probably don't want to go too many tab sets deep, before your users might lose the thread of what they're looking at. But you can also use, so here I'm highlighting that there's a different option. So I can change it to tab set dropdown just to maybe distinguish sort of the feel of what the users are getting in the tab. So now when I click on interactive tables, I have a little bit different tab set option. I think there may be a few other choices as well, but just to help the user know that they've kind of moved inside of a tab. So I've just highlighted two table packages, just very briefly. The first is the data table package. The other is the reactable package. These are both based on underlying libraries in different languages and maybe have different features that you like or don't like depending on what you're trying to do. So the reactable, one thing I liked about it is that it had this sort of ability to create these sort of drop downs for by category. But you can also do things like filter. So if I say recession equal to true, it's filtered the data down to recession periods. I've also added this color by just to show how bad are things getting. You can see where the pandemic hit. And if I want to, I can continue to dynamically narrow things down to just quarter start dates, just so it's a little bit shorter table to look at. So again, that's not even scratching the surface of what reactable can do, but just giving you a sort of placeholder for that. So data table is probably the one I've worked with a little bit more, but has very similar sort of out of the box capabilities. Can set things up to filter your data. Basically with just one simple option, you can give the users the ability to download. They can either copy or download a CSV or an Excel file of the data, which if you have users that really like to interact with the data, do their own analysis, this can be very helpful. I would say before you put things in a table, in a report, you probably want to carefully consider how much data you're giving your end users. Hopefully you're at the point where really you're narrowed things down to sort of final outputs rather than, sourcing millions of rows of data at this point is probably not optimal, because all of this has to get stored essentially in an HTML file and back end. There's no database or something connected at the back end. It's basically embedded in this HTML file. So that's the tables packages. So one thing that I did mention, so I created sort of a color scale. I won't talk through that, but this color ramp function is really useful if you need to create some kind of color scale. You're not satisfied with the scales that come within R. So I created one that sort of went from white to like burnt red with orange in the middle. So just looking a little bit closer at the plotting mechanisms. So if I scroll back up to that tab. So right now I'm on a reactable plot. So, or sorry, not reactable, high charter plot. So to me, high charter was sort of a new thing. It behaves seemingly pretty similar to Plotly, just, out of the box. But actually seems to load a little bit more nicely in some ways than Plotly from my experience. But really all I did here was, link this up to that parameter for plot type. The nice thing about Plotly is that you can build a ggplot and then just use the ggplotly function and have a Plotly plot. High charter requires a bit more syntax that may take a little bit more time to get used to compared to just building things in ggplot and turning them into a Plotly. But no matter which you choose, you can get a nice looking plot. I would say if you're going to build an HTML, giving your users the interactivity is really a highlight. I wouldn't necessarily want to put a fixed ggplot into an HTML report unless someone really preferred to have that. But it gives you some of the options to turn things off and on. Can adjust the scales automatically, which makes it a little more fun for the user as well. All right. So just to review some of the dazzling elements in the R Markdown file. So using those parameters in the YAML header, which again, I think is probably the single biggest thing that can make your report kind of set it apart from others. Hiding those kinds of code chunks and other Easter egg type elements for your fellow analysts. Using the tabs and the drop downs to improve the pagination. If you don't like tabs, you can also use some of the templates that basically are formatted more like text documents where they have sections with sort of running content, table of contents on the side so that people can sort of click and still scroll through kind of linearly rather than doing the different tabs. It's helpful to add meaningful color to output. I say meaningful because adding too much color can sometimes throw your user off or make them see a story that you don't really think is a story. So trying to highlight things as appropriate. And then I mentioned that you can use these themes. There's this nice R Markdown theme gallery by Andrew Ziffler, who I believe was at the U of M previously, he may still be. Where he still is. He still is. All right. Yeah. So he highlighted all of the different themes really nicely, so you can get a sense of what you're going to get from just the out of the box themes. And then at the end, he also talks about themes that come from other packages. So that's a really good link to follow up on. Just to review the folder infrastructure that you should consider setting up. So store your long R scripts separate from your R Markdown files. I didn't mention this, but if you have pre-processing of data that takes a long time, see if you can do that ahead of time and sort of either store things as CSV file or an RDS file, or in some sort of database before you actually go into the reporting phase. And then another key is just don't try to fit too much into one report. Reports should really be targeted with sort of one objective. If it feels like they're getting into too many areas, just make a second report or make a third report. And you can certainly keep it in the reports folder and just have different purposes, but keep everything together in sort of a reporting folder. So here is sort of the general layout of the tutorial folder. So you can see I have some data. The presentation that I'm showing you right now is also in this folder with the other files that go with that. Reporting folder, which doesn't quite represent what you have, but because you have a few more versions of things. And then the script folder, which right now just has one R script. So throughout this, you may all be kind of thinking, HTML seems like a weird kind of reporting format. Why would I want to use that? I'm not really used to that. I'm used to PDF or Word. So what I think is great about HTML is that it's interactive, but not shiny. So you don't need sort of the special tools to make it operate correctly. It's portable. You can send it in an email, and hopefully everyone at this point has access to a web browser on their computer. so they should be able to open it and, see things right away. Can store it in your local file system for your team to access and open at any time. And so get into a little bit, you can create a PDF, but tech overhead can be high when it comes to R Markdown. And, I've worked across different environments, and R Markdown files can sometimes fail to knit in different environments. In particular, if you do not have admin rights to your computer, at times it can be tricky to make sure that you have everything set up correctly to knit to PDF. So I know some of you are saying, no, but I have to produce a PDF. Like that's what my boss wants, or that's what my team is sort of demanding from me. So if you have to do that, basically there's this tiny tech installation. You may already have a version of tech on your computer because you've used it in other circumstances or off on its own. This tiny tech is basically a custom version that is as small as it can be to still function within sort of the R Markdown knit environment, and is built by the same author who created the R Markdown package and the knit R package. So this link will take you out to the page on Tiny Tech. But as colleagues have told me, this doesn't always work as well either. So there's sometimes where even using Tiny Tech will fail. What's nice about this installation is that it will, if you're missing a specific LaTeX package that needs to be installed, it will try to automatically install that. So for example, there's a package in R by Rob Heinemann called vitae that you can use for building customized like resumes or curriculum vitaes. And it uses some pretty custom themes when it comes to R Markdown, and has some LaTeX installations that don't come in Tiny Tech. For me, I was able to knit it just fine on my home computer, but when I switched into sort of my work environment, it wouldn't work and I couldn't make it work. So I would probably have to go through IT to make it work. So let me just show quickly. I do have sort of a version of called Dazzle PDF. So you can open that. It has a lot of the same items as the versions that go to HTML. Here I haven't really customized any output features, so I just have PDF document. I still can use parameters, which is nice. There's just some things that you don't have the ability to do the interaction. You can't do tabs in the same way that I was for HTML, but I can use some of the ideas that were there. And now I'm going to be using a different table package, the Cable Extra package, which is really probably the best one out there for going to PDF. So again, I have just the code to grab that unemployment data. And then I'm just going to do a ggplot in this case. So when I knit this one, I should get a PDF that pops up. If you're all knitting, it would be interesting to know how many of you run into any errors on your side, just to emphasize the point that it can be a little trickier to set up. So what is nice is you get where I had like the headers, you get sort of the running table of contents. I can't, my stuff doesn't just, I can't close and open it to hide it. Again, the interactivity is gone. I can't hide like my analyst information. It just sort of has to be printed or not. When you're creating a table for PDF, you obviously have to be perhaps a lot more choosy with what you're showing. So here I've really narrowed down what I wanted to show, just a select set of dates. And then I've got my color scale to highlight, where things were the worst in sort of purple and the best in sort of the orange color. So it still can have some of the elements, you can go through a lot of the customization options. You still have access to LaTeX. Obviously, that's a big piece of it. And then formatting plots maybe just takes slightly more effort just to make sure things fit on the page correctly, or have sort of the right location. For anybody that's worked with LaTeX, sometimes you have to really force the location of a certain plot to get it to end up where you want it to be. So I can show you here just a little bit of the code for the cable extra. So you can see I did a little bit more filtering just to make sure that my data was a bit smaller. Cable extra, again, is like its own sort of vocabulary. There's a lot of options. You can see here is where I've used the LaTeX option. Sort of funny, there's a lowercase hold position where it tries to put it where you want. And then if you really want it there, then you use uppercase hold to indicate you really want it in this location. And then here I've got define the color scale. But cable extra, there's a whole vignette with that package that if you're really looking to learn more about PDF options, that I would highly recommend just navigating to the CRAN page and grabbing that vignette to look through. Oh, and as I mentioned, right, if you don't have admin rights, sometimes it can be tricky to deal with any sort of issues that pop up as you're knitting to PDF. So I know that the table and plotting information that I gave you was sort of a draw the rest of the owl sort of situation where I gave you a few tidbits, but to draw some circles, but I didn't tell you how to fill in all the feathers and the details. But I'm just sort of giving some light recommendations that I think DT and Reactable can be good table packages to start with for HTML. And as far as I know, for PDF, the Cable Extra package is sort of the gold standard for getting really nicely formatted tables. And then similar for graphical content. So ggplot2 is, again, the gold standard for a lot of things. And it's really can work well within Plotly, but also things like animation. If you wanted to do a GG animate, I've never tried putting an animation into a report, but I'm guessing that it would work. And then High Charter, which is perhaps helpful for people who've come from an environment that requires High Charter for publishing aspects. So here's just a couple of tips around building your tables and graphics. We'll say the second one first. So build these things before you move them into your report. It's probably, especially if you have a very long report with a lot of R code chunks, you want to be sure that it's going to work as you expect before you just continue to hit knit over and over again. Remove some of the overhead before you add it back in. Really use your tables and your graphics to support the narrative that you're trying to give your end users. Think of it like maybe something like app development, where you might actually draw out like how you want your users to work through it. Draw some boxes, like I want a chart here and a table here, and how do I want these tabs to be set up? Where do I want to have text? Where do I want to be able to put in some custom analysis? That kind of thing can be really helpful to do before you just sort of dive in, although it's also fine just to dive in. I mentioned this maybe briefly throughout, but thinking about your users' needs. So I know I have several users who really like to be able to download the data. That's sort of an essential thing for them. So being able to sort of accommodate that kind of thing, or if you think about like tables and charts, like especially with charts, like you might want to be able to take a snapshot. So Plotly gives sort of an automated tool that will make a snapshot that doesn't require a user to, go and use a screenshotting tool of their own. But maybe there's the ability just to download a picture, based on what you've given them. And then using color in an intentional way. So I've seen this statistic before. I don't want to be the give people bad statistics, but I've seen it enough that I'm thinking that this may be true. So that 1 in 12 men are colorblind, which is not necessarily something people think about when they use things like stoplight colors. So red and green are that's probably the most common type of color blindness. So using scales that sort of change in luminescence rather than change in color. So a scale from white to blue, or just different shades of blue, is much better than a scale that goes from sort of red to green. And then I think trying to use color to really show where there are notable things and keep things that are not notable sort of don't have color. So really only highlight things that are notable rather than having everything associated with a color. And then just a couple of additional sort of user experience principles. This is where, again, the storyboarding element can be very helpful, to have a clear hierarchy that makes your user's navigation pretty natural. I've heard, things like users saying, well, I feel stupid when I look at this. Then something has gone wrong, basically. If your user feels like they just don't know how to do it, because it's pretty likely your users are all very smart people, and it's really up to you to make it so that they can actually get the information they need from the report. So perhaps having sort of like an initial feedback session to make sure that everyone understands what's the content of the report, how do we kind of move around in the report. If they give specific information about, what they want where, you can accommodate that. Embracing and understanding accessibility. So again, with things like color, maybe print size, any aspects like that. One thing that I haven't been able to do too much yet in my reporting, but I've read as a good UX principle, is sort of having hover over text. So if someone hovers over specific things, to have like a useful piece of text that pops up each time they do that. And then the last one, which I think is hard because we all love to try new things, is to transition to or away from ideas slowly, so that your users don't see one version of a report and then the next version looks like a totally different thing. So you might have to maintain some things that ideally you would drop over time, but do it in a way that maybe the user doesn't notice them dropping away. And in particular, like if suddenly you want to use a totally new package and it has all sorts of different functionality than the previous package, finding ways to sort of make things a little bit backwards compatible so your user can sort of get the gist before they really are fully engulfed in that new idea. And then just some extensions of these ideas. So I mentioned I wasn't going to tell you how to set up version control, but I would absolutely recommend using version control. All of the stuff, with maybe the exception of saving a bunch of data that is in this folder is really compatible with using version control, especially for anything in R Markdown, so that you can, share with colleagues, collaborate with colleagues, and also have the ability to revert if needed, which definitely comes in handy when someone's like, oh, you made me a report in December that I really liked. Can I have it in that exact format? And you're like, well, I've already made a bunch of changes. You might have the chance to do that. So, there's some features in Git that can make that really easy, like tagging versions, basically saying like, this is the version we used for, month end December 2020 or year end December 2020. Tagging sort of significant updates each as you go through as well can be helpful. Like I mentioned, if you have a company that has access to the enterprise tools that RStudio provides, things like RStudio Connect, you can actually make your reporting more on like a scheduled basis, which would be really nice. You don't have to do anything. It'll just automatically deploy with perhaps some updated parameters. You can also connect in some ways to email servers. And essentially when a new report is deployed, it will blast an email to you or to any of your colleagues or to sort of end users. And then, as I mentioned, if your users are really asking for the ability to do a lot more interaction in a way that sort of can't be all stored in the back end and in your HTML file, then you might need to consider extending to Shiny reporting. But I would say that your HTML report will be a great basis to do that rather than sort of starting from scratch. So I watched an RStudio talk a couple weeks ago about doing code first data science, and they said something that resonated with me, which is basically like the first time you do a report, it's like a huge amount of time, but then when someone asks you to update it, it's like 5 minutes compared to the original investment. And so the original investment is well worth it, because then people are like, oh, can you do a version for HR? Can you do a version for this or that? And the more you can automate those pieces of the report, the more time you get to spend on doing new fun analysis, because basically you've made it so that your users can sort of change parameters as needed, or your users can, you can just do a slight tweak and basically you have what looks like maybe an entirely new report. So I will stop there, just a few references that I use throughout, and just want to give credit to the artists for a lot of the really cool tidyr and tidyverse kind of artwork from Allison Horst, and you can check out her GitHub. And I think they strongly encourage using that artwork if you're giving our talks on things that require useful visualizations. And then, sort of the classic R for data science reference, which honestly does have seemingly everything you need to get started in R. Advanced R, as I mentioned, the happy Git with R. And then just this talk, which was sort of an inspiration for me to get started in some of this R Markdown reporting from January 2020 RStudio conference. So would recommend looking at that as well. And with that, just see if there's any questions.
Am I audible?
Yep, you should be. Lindsey can hear you.
Yeah, excellent presentation, Lindsey. Thanks for that wonderful talk. So I was wondering whether we can write YAML in such a way that if I'm using a Word document, that automatically it uses flex table package. And if I'm using a PDF, I want the document to be rendered using cable extra. Is there a way we can do that? Some kind of loop or something?
Sorry, can you say, so you want to be able to render to Word? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, if I'm using, like if I'm rendering to Word document, I want the table to be rendered using flex table. And if I'm rendering PDF document, I want it to be rendered using cable extra because both are not compatible, right? So is there a way we can do something in YAML to get this done?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think maybe you would want, so definitely in R Markdown, the way I showed it, you can just knit inside of the interface using the button, but there's certainly, I think, the option to, actually use R Markdown functions directly in the in the console. So that might be the way to do it. And then you could maybe pass in a parameter. I mean, if they're really not compatible, then I might just suggest, looking at doing it as two different reports. But yeah, sorry, I don't have maybe a better answer, but that's a great question.
Hey, Lindsay, I have a question sort of about getting buy-in. So these are all really beautiful HTML reports, but if I email someone an HTML file, they're not going to know what to do with it because they just aren't used to working with those. So how do you gently guide people towards, hey, this HTML file is really cool and I want you to look at it, and how do I get people to avoid oh, can you just send me a Word doc, please?
Sure. Well, so I think in some cases, what we were starting from was a place where maybe we had a 50 to 100 page document filled with essentially tables that could all be contained in a drop down. And so, we were sort of able to do a little bit of a transition period where we created, the old version of the report alongside the new HTML report. And I think once people realized, hey, I don't have to literally scroll through 100 pages to find the table that I want or the one that I'm interested, or I can sort of visually put things side by side instead of, trying to deal with it in PDF form, that sort of did the convincing for us. But I think, people just aren't used to opening HTML files when it doesn't come from just the internet. And basically it's just a matter of maybe doing a walkthrough with them and sort of showing them hey, this captures all of the elements of this old report, but now you get to customize sort of what you want to look at rather than, dealing with the idea of scrolling through a bunch of tabs. And I think you could maybe also pitch it from a resource saving perspective, hey, it takes me, 40 hours each month to do this in this custom way, versus if I just run it this way, it might take me 1 hour to update. That can always be a helpful technique as well.
Sorry. Okay. So my Zoom freaked out on me, but now I'm able to talk again. So were you able to tell someone about how to share HTMLs with confidential info?
So I think I would, if you have something with confidential info, I would probably suggest putting it in sort of an access controlled location. So you might have a set of folders that have only certain people are privy to, and that's where I would put, output the report, or tools like RStudio Connect, basically allow you to add specific users to reports so that you can sort of protect the information in them. And then obviously whatever sort of particular information classification system you have, you can add the correct text and that have that kind of protection. But really, yeah, I think I've mostly relied on the items around the report to protect it, to make sure that only the right people have access.
Cool. And then I missed some things. Were you able to tell people about how to make your documents 508 compliant? Like if you have complicated tables?
You know, I do not know what that means.
Yeah, me either.
So I will say that I'm technically not a federal employee, even though I work for the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, but that is a good question. And I wish I'll definitely have to look at that later, because I do work with people who are federal government employees.
And go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna let Chase ask his question. Maybe
Thank you
wrap
very
up.
much. And wonderful talk here, Lindsay. Thank you. Our data pipelines are only as good as the upstream data. I'm in a live presentation running one of these live reports coming from NASA's JPL OmniWeb site. And as I'm running through this massive data, I'm getting errors. It's like, oh my gosh, what's happened? On closer inspection, they changed their data upstream without notifying, and they had errors because they had just changed their data pipeline. And so my discovery helped them fix theirs. You are in an environment where there's lots of source data. How do you insulate yourself? I mean, what came through my mind was running hash, whenever I download data chunks, I do a hash value and I somehow put it in my report. So at least I know whatever my pipeline delivered, this is what my upstream sources were. But you've got to be hitting that at times in your career where things have changed, you didn't know about it, and your pipeline suddenly is spitting out different information, even though you've got things under Git.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to the types of reporting, I guess that I've done, it's really been mostly on data that's kind of already been vetted and gone through a number of processes and is really more like output reporting. But if you're looking to report more on like source data, I can see where, perhaps you would want to add in like a bit more data validation, maybe before you run your report. So it could be something that, you don't want to find out when you run your report. You want to have that process upstream of actually, doing the work that comes out of the report. And
I'll just add that it was 1970s data.
okay.
So it had been around for a long time, but again, they just changed their data flow and that happened. So I just, I guess for the audience is to consider data provenance is important, and you're only as good as the upstream data. And sometimes those things like remote sensors, they change as they get recalibrated or somebody changes their data pipeline. But anyway, thank you. This was I love your layout. That is really nice.
Thank you. Yes, this is, I don't know how to say it, Xanagran presentation, another tool from the inventor of R Markdown and this tiny tech package to make nice presentations. So with that, I think I will take us into the break, and we'll be back at 1/2 past the hour to jump into the next tutorial.